Welcome to the conversation with Al McFarland. I'm your host, Al McFarland. So instead of presenting you a live program today, I'm sharing with you one of my favorite episodes, a show that shows you how we've molded the show that you've come to know and love. And while you're enjoying this show, I'm going to be working with my team to make the program even more informative, more insightful, and even more inspiring. And if you haven't already, I'd like you to show your support for the conversation with Al McFarland by subscribing to the Inside News YouTube channel. This way you'll get alerted about and never miss new episodes, show clips, and special features only available on the Inside News channel. And you can find us on YouTube at Inside News MN. To make it easier, I've got a link in the description on this video. Well, thank you again for all your support this year. I can't wait for you to see all that we are preparing for 2023. Now, my friend, sit back and enjoy this conversation with Al McFarland. Today, a few minutes ago, Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman announced third-degree and murder and manslaughter charges will be brought against one of the officers. I want to have a discussion about the criminal justice system. How do we change it? How do we make something different? I'm pleased to have in conversation Dr. Brittany Lewis. She's founder of Research in Action. It's an urban research strategy and community engagement firm that uses human-centered design to move from equity-based language to equity-based actions. And I'm pleased to have Ed Chung, who is Vice President for Criminal Justice Reform at Center for American Progress. His work focuses on reducing the footprint of the criminal justice system while making it fairer, more equitable, and more effective. Hope to be joined in a few minutes by former Durham Police Chief Sherilyn C.J. Davis. She's now the president of National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And so this is a good group to have a good conversation. Thank you all for being here. If you're listening, share this with your friends, start a watch party. Let's expand this conversation. And you can send us questions or join the conversation by monitoring this on Facebook and YouTube. We'll try to pay attention and have your voice, your questions be presented to our panelists as well. Let me start with you, Brittany, Dr. Brittany Lewis. Just give us a framework for the things we should be thinking about all the time in considering criminal justice reform, changing the criminal justice system.
There are two really important kind of grounding initiatives that I want to mention. So I'm a member of the Minnesota Task Force on Police-Involved Shootings. I'm a member of the Youth Justice Council, which really focuses on reform in the juvenile probation center in Hennepin County. And I'm also a board member of the Legal Rights Center. And in all three of those spaces, we are actively reflecting on and thinking really deeply about reform and the work that we do. So in the Legal Rights Center, we're really well known for our work with restorative justice work in the schools and in the juvenile justice system, particularly ensuring that young folks of color have the representation that they need. So in many ways, we really need to support the organizations that are doing the on-the-ground work. And I want to make sure to first highlight that there are a number of organizations focusing on that direct work that we need to invest more of our attention and resources into. The second thing that I mentioned is a number of efforts that have been happening all across the country to address police reform, 21st century policing. The city of Minneapolis was one of the pilot sites years ago. And I think we need to reflect on what it means to have been a pilot site, and then also what it means that this is where that is happening. So what about the bias training and the work done hasn't made the shift that we expected that it would? We need to ask that question really critically. As far as the Minnesota Task Force on Police-Involved Shooting that Attorney General Ellison and Department of Correction head Harrington has led, I believe deeply in having to create tables where we speak across sectors, because change won't happen otherwise. And I know in that process, community, as they should be really upset, were both visibly angry by the fact that the task force included the police unions and others. But the only way for this change or reform to take place is if we have all folks at the table. I'm willing to also be honest about the gaps in its own identities and what they're actually there to do, whom they're aimed to serve. Because you can't do something to someone. I think communities of color are too far used to that happening to them. And this effort to reform, we all have to figure out what these tables look like, what we're willing to be honest about in order to ensure that everyone gets the treatment they deserve. And we also know very well that Black and brown bodies haven't been getting that treatment historically. We're living in the feeling and trauma of those moments. And as far as the Youth Justice Council goes, we are supposed to release this summer. There was an internal report done on the juvenile probation system in Hennepin County. There were 21 recommendations made that connect to reforms that need to take place to ensure that our young people are having an equitable experience. And the reality of it is, this report illustrates the ways perhaps which we are not meeting that need. The Youth Council's role is to address these 21 recommendations and build the partnerships needed to shift those systems. We have the probation department at the table, and they are acknowledging that that has to happen. It's a collaborative effort, and it requires real intention, and community need to be at the table. And that's a big part of the reason they invited me to the table. As Al mentioned, my company, Research and Action, focuses on urban research strategy and engagement work. And I'd argue that for any policy or practice to change, there has to be a real intentional, equitable engagement strategy that requires a lot of folks to come to the table and be honest about our gaps, how we haven't been serving one another, and willing to partner in ways that take more time than we would like, that ask government to reimagine how it shows up in community, and also ask us to flex muscles that we haven't before. So I mention these efforts because there are things that have taken place, whether you're talking about the pilot work done in the Minneapolis Police Department years ago, and we need to interrogate why that work didn't do what it aimed to do. We also have to be honest about communities' willingness to engage in some of these conversations, how we engage, and be really clear about what we're asking for. So I wanted to make sure to highlight some of those efforts and know that the report that was written on the analysis of the juvenile justice system in Hennepin County will be released this summer. It will be made public, and our goal is really to partner with community to address these kind of recommendations.
I was talking about your microphone and I wasn't being unmuted, so I've done that now. Thank you. But try to hold your mic up like a microphone just to give me the strongest voice possible next round in the conversation. Ed, jump in here and introduce yourself and introduce the work of the Center for American Progress and the Criminal Justice Reform Initiative that you lead. And you're a prosecutor, right? That's your background.
Yeah, that's my background. Thanks, Al, for having me. Really appreciate this. Obviously, first and foremost, all our thoughts, all of our attention goes to the community of Minneapolis, to Dr. Lewis, to Brittany, and for the communities that you are working with and represent. And so, can't imagine what the tension and what people are going through right now. My background as a prosecutor, I was a local prosecutor. I went to the Department of Justice. I was a civil rights prosecutor there. I prosecuted excessive force cases, use of force cases, and these are very difficult cases to prove. And we can get into that in a little bit, but from there, I had the good fortune in the last administration and the above administration to work on some of the efforts that Brittany was mentioning, including the initiative to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Also on the 21st Century Policing Task Force. And I think, Brittany raised a lot of great points. It's kind of, it's a reckoning of some sort. about the steps that we take, how big those steps should be. Are those steps enough? Is it too limiting to talk only about policing? I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. And how all of these systems interact with each other. What we do here at the Center for American Progress, we are a DC-based national think tank. Over the last several years, what we've tried to do is take the good things that are happening from different communities across the country and show to a broader audience that there is a better way and there's a different way to do things. I think one of the biggest things that we want to push out there, and you mentioned that our push is to shrink the size of the criminal justice system. And not only the size of it, but the reach of it, because both are way too large in all of our societies. We need to not define public safety in just one way and equate it only with the criminal justice system or equate it only with law enforcement. If we do that, our imaginations of what can happen are much limited, and we only have a limited set of tools at that point to address a wide variety of social issues that require much more broad, as Brittany was talking about, intersectional, cross-sector work, deep, hard work that happens on the ground, not at the level that we're talking about here, obviously from a DC-based think tank, but things that are happening across the country. And so, that's a broader perspective here. Policing, to me, is the most important thing to focus on because it is the entry point into the criminal justice system. And until we address that part of it, we can talk about reentry. Reentry is incredibly important. We could talk about sentencing. All of that is very important. But the way that most people get involved in the criminal justice system is through a contact with law enforcement, with police. And unfortunately, too many times we've seen what happened in Minneapolis, in Kentucky, in Baltimore, in Ferguson, and places all around the country. And those are the things that when we're talking about criminal justice reform, we cannot leave out. It's not only that we can't leave out, we have to start out with policing and accountable policing. And I hope we get into this discussion about what that actually means.
Certainly. Let me introduce our third guest on the program, and that's Chief C.J. Davis. She's Durham Police Chief. Our C.J. Davis is president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And prior to her appointment as Durham Chief of Police in 2016, she spent 30 years with the Atlanta Police Department, where she rose through the ranks and retired as Deputy Chief. Chief, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you for the invite.
And we want to have a conversation about what reforming, fixing, changing the criminal justice system looks like, how it can happen. And, Ed just talked about the point of analysis has to be where people come in contact with the system. That's where you are as a police chief. So talk about, if you would, your role and the noble vision of reforming police policy, criminal justice system policy, how and what we can do to improve the relationship, the experience, and the outcome for people of color in particular, but the general public as a whole.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much. We have been leaning forward just in total disbelief in what we've seen over the last week. And I can assure you that the members of my organization who have been in the trenches for a very long time, trying to impact change in the industry, are heartbroken right now because we work every day trying to build those relationships, build that trust. But I'll tell you where our problems come into play, or where we fail on so many different levels, is that even though we introduce policies to various administrations, it takes those individuals to push the policies to be effective, not just in my organization, but in organizations around the country. There's small agencies and small towns where, quite frankly, those executives don't feel like, there is a problem. Mm-hmm. And unless there is some level of policy change at the federal level to mandate changes, then we're going to see, and I hate to say it, we will see another Minneapolis play out in some other town in America. And it's time for us to get really, really serious. And that's why Noble feels like our work right now is more important than ever, because we are the pulse of our community. We come from our community. And I tell folks all the time that I don't wake up in the morning with my uniform on. I wake up in the morning as African-American female. I did 30 years in the city of Atlanta, in the home of the civil rights movement. And fortunately, we didn't have as many of the racial issues during my career as I see play out in some other cities. As the chief of police for the last 4 years in North Carolina, I had to go in and reform my department. I had to really take a surgical look at policies, procedures, methods of accountability. And that's what's important in our organizations right now. And unless we have a broad approach about what change looks like and push leaders to make those changes and hold them accountable, it's unfortunate that these kinds of incidents will play out over and over again. And people are sick of it. We're all sick of it.
Let's start with George Floyd. George Floyd on Monday, Memorial Day evening, was, we're saying, murdered. He died laying on the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back, a police officer with a knee on his neck. And the bystander video and the area videos suggest that there was no resistance, and that we all heard and saw this man pleading for his life, saying, "I cannot breathe, I can't breathe," finally calling for his mother, and finally the life going out of him, at least when the paramedics arrived and dropped him on the gurney, put him in their vehicle. They indicated that there was no pulse. He was pronounced dead at the Hennepin County Medical Center. Looking at that particular incident now, which is burning into all of our minds, how do we start talking about the problems and the needs of criminal justice, starting with that particular encounter of a human or a consumer or a person and a law enforcement official? How do we take that and look at the entire apparatus, the enterprise, and suggest what ought to be happening?
So, when I look at that snapshot, that incident, the only thing that I could really focus on is what policies, what can we do to change that? And I can tell you 3 things that were a failure on that particular scene. There was a failure to intervene, for one thing, by the other officers that are on the scene. There was a failure to render aid, to provide medical attention to George Floyd. And there was a failure to de-escalate that situation, which probably should have started out that way in the first place. And we would have never seen George Floyd on the ground. But you have agencies that are ensuring that de-escalation training is being done. They have policies that require and mandate that officers intervene when another officer is applying some type of inappropriate force. And then you also have agencies that have made it a mandate that officers render aid, even if you're in the process of arresting someone. That person is a human being, and they deserve to be treated like a human being and be provided the aid and medical attention that they need. Those are 3 things that went terribly wrong. But if our executives and police chiefs and sheriffs around the country are forced to implement these policies to make sure that these types of situations are controlled, then I think that's a step in the right direction. It's not the panacea for it, but there's so many agencies that don't have those types of policies and procedures as mandated guidelines.
When you talk, Ed, about reducing the footprint of the criminal justice system, how does that show up here? And I'm thinking particularly about 2 things at the front and back of this particular incident. There are more, but these 2 to start with. One is I've gotten several emails from people questioning whether or not the EMT personnel should be equally fired and charged, because they have an obligation to assess and render an assessment of the condition of the person they're picking up. They didn't do it. They didn't do it, is what I'm being told. So number two is, Brittany, what kind of call from the store owner about supposedly a $20 or $25 forgery or some kind of transaction, counterfeit transaction, leads to the death of the apprehended alleged, perpetrator of a crime, of passing a bad check. So that's spreading it out. And how do you bring those considerations into the need to understand differently the apparatus, Ed Chung, how the criminal justice system works?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have Brittany touch on the issue of how this all started, but let me give a little bit about that, because that's exactly what came to mind immediately when you mentioned that. I mean, we're talking about a very low level offense, if anything at all. We don't even know if this, we don't even know the facts of, what that interaction was, if it's a petty theft or something like that. And for somebody, when you're talking, when the chief is talking about de-escalation tactics, one of the things that goes into de-escalation is whether or not it should be escalated, whether it's a situation based on the type of offense or the call that somebody was responding to. So Chief Davis knows this more than I do, but if the call was for somebody who is committing violence, or if there's a, there's a, melee of some kind or something, that puts officers in a different mindset to come into this. But this is a call for forgery. And so to have that level of force and that level applied for something like that questions what would happen if it was something even more than that, and what other types of situations that go unreported, especially on street stops or something else. And so these are the types of contexts that we're talking about that can escalate and lead to just sad and horrific and devastating situations. But to your other point about others involved, not only EMTs, I mean, I think you mentioned at the beginning, Al, that the Hennepin County DA just recently announced charges today or within the hour of the actual officer who had the knee on the neck of George Floyd. And I apologize for folks who are listening. We, if we're talking bluntly about this, and if it affects you, but how about the other three officers? And I understand that there's some of this stuff takes time. But there's an officer who is only standing, looking at the crowd, not doing anything, looks like standing watch and protecting the other officers in that situation. Then you go into a second angle that looks kind of from the other side that came out later, and you see two other officers also on top of Mr. Floyd. And one, it seemed like it was on the kind of the lower back, which if somebody was trying to breathe, and if you're in a prone position and you're putting pressure on the lower back, I mean, that causes additional difficulty in breathing, to say the least. And I obviously am not a medical professional, but those are the things that I, as a prosecutor, would look at. So the concern here is that the obvious person to hold accountable is the person the officer who had the knee on the neck. But what is the accountability for everyone else? And that's really the question that needs to be answered, and needs to be answered quickly, because one of the issues that we've seen in the last day or two, I apologize for going on here, is that the speed of the investigation matters when it comes to building trust with your community. The whole phrase of justice delayed, right? You have a video, you have multiple videos, and to take 4 days to have charges announced, to me, there needs to be some explanation behind that.
Yeah, I agree completely. What we are witnessing on the streets in Minneapolis is real trauma and pain. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir when I'm talking with you all, when we talk about where rioting comes from.
Bring your mic up to hold up like a microphone.
I think I'm preaching to the choir when I talk with you all about our understanding of where rioting comes from. you know, I reference often the results of the Kerner Commission report in 1968. It was a report written to ask, well, why are riots happening? Right. And this was the first time that those are directly experiencing police violence, segregation, racial discrimination got to actually impact the findings of a federal report. And the federal government didn't like what they found in that report. It implicated them in the problem. And they neglected to address any of the recommendations made in the Kerner Commission report. And one of the famous lines in there is like, we're moving toward two societies, one separate, unequal, one white, one Black, right? And the phrase in there that I find to be fascinating is that we're moving to. No, we are in a society. We haven't moved toward anything. And it is reliving itself. The fact that it was a low-level offense, there is not a reason in the world that it should have gotten to this point. But the reality is that Black and brown folks know that their bodies are violent in itself, or a threat in itself. And we've seen this over and over again from Trayvon to Tamir, et cetera. It should never have gotten to this point. I appreciate Chief Davis mentioning very tangible realities of what failed to intervene by other officers, failed to provide medical attention, failed to de-escalate. In the Minnesota Task Force on Police-Involved Shooting, we talked a great deal about de-escalation. And a number of officers talked openly about whether it's a lack of training or oversaturation of training. It was a really interesting dialogue that I saw happening amongst officers themselves. So when she talks about the need for a surgical look at our policies and practices, that's exactly what we should be doing. But let's also be clear, there have been many reports written on the city of Minneapolis police that become internal reports that we never see. And they do that because it's one of the most coveted organizations in the nation. And it's aiming to protect itself, not us. So what Chief Davis suggested is exactly what we should be doing. Years ago, I still have the proposal sitting in my laptop. We tried to partner with the National Initiative and the Minneapolis Police Department to study police culture and ethics. Do you think they signed up for that? Absolutely not. And we talked a great deal about, there's so many issues that need to be addressed, but it requires the police and its organizations to be vulnerable, which that is not how it as an institution is set up. So when we discussed about studying police culture, we were also talking about the stages of policing, right? So you're seeing things like high divorce rates, high alcoholism. You're seeing a lot of different things because they also carry trauma, but we don't talk about that. We don't also talk about how them carrying trauma comes into the streets and how that impacts community police relationships, but we're not willing to take that surgical look and also provide our officers with the help that they need. There's so much work that needs to be done, but it's such a coveted organization that is in fear of being honest about itself, that hurt people hurt people. There's so much work to be done.
Chief Davis, jump in. Before you do, I raised the question, when you talk about honest conversation, is there an honest conversation that'll result in some language like, we really intend to keep oppressing you, that our good fortune is your misfortune, and we want to preserve our good fortune. Therefore, we are motivated to keep you in a condition that doesn't threaten or rival our condition, our opportunity, our sense of who we are in the world, and the sense of who you are that we've created for you and about you, and that informs how we treat you and act around you. Is that line of thinking something that's worth talking about, Chief Davis?
Yes, it is. We're really talking about historical kinds of issues that, the uniform represents. For many, many years, it's not so much the color of the person in the uniform, it's the uniform that has wreaked havoc in primarily minority communities. So, when we talk about police brutality and excessive force, it's not so much about the white officer. It's about the person in that uniform who's been entrusted to do the right thing, whether they're Black, white, or otherwise. And I think that's why police officers feel some kind of way when you take them through implicit bias training, because they think the implicit bias training is you're beating them on the head for being white. You're beating them on the head for what happened, 25, 30, 40 years ago. And, I didn't have a part in that. But what we try to teach our officers is that it's not about you, it's about the community and how the community has experienced historical racism. Mm-hmm. And that uniform represents an occupying force in their community. And they feel like that they don't have the right to run down the street. They don't have the right to just go inside. And as it was said earlier by Edward, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I got dropped for a second there.
Lost you for a second.
But as it was said by Edward, that the actual offense was we're in the middle of a pandemic. Here in Durham, we're not arresting anybody for anything. So that really resonated with me. And that's an agreement that not just our officers have in the department, we have that agreement with the court systems and the jails, that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And unless somebody is committing a violent crime where we need to incarcerate them, we will make no arrests. And we haven't made any arrests. We haven't made any arrests that were COVID related. We haven't made any arrests that were misdemeanors. We just tell folks, hey, we're going to get you next time. You're going to have to, get yourself together for right now. But that particular incident on Memorial Day did not raise to the level of even having an encounter with the police. But it's been talked about before. A lot of it was about the culture and the fact that everybody gets up in that uniform and they go out to be the police. And I've had to tell my folks, right now, we're not the police. We're supporting a health crisis. And whatever that looks like for us to get through that health crisis with our community, that's the role that we will play. We've done everything from helping to feed the community, helping them to get to hotels where they can have shelter. But my philosophy and my ideology about my work is sort of in my spot, in Durham. That's why sitting on national boards and being bold and courageous, and that's what we need our chiefs to do, be bold and courageous about what is wrong and what has to change. So that's the conversation that we're having, even with our white colleagues, those that are willing to carry that message, because they have more influence than we do.
Chief, how big is your force? How big is your organization?
I have 600.
And then how difficult was it for you to change the culture or to address the culture? I'm operating from the sense that I thought you said you tackled that, and I'm presuming that you succeeded, but I don't know that. So tell me about that. What was the challenge? What did you do? What did you find? And what did you do? And how do you assess where you are now in terms of the culture of the organization?
Right. Well, I wouldn't celebrate just yet. Success is relative, I guess. But we've had I think my first 2 years were a real challenge because random roadblocks and things that were traditionally within the police operation, the routine work that they do every day. And so I come in and they want to know what's wrong with the way that they've been operating. Mm-hmm. You say that we're doing something wrong, and we've been doing it this way and been successful in crime reduction for X amount of years. Well, when I came in, you told me you wanted to have a better relationship with the community. That's what all of you said. Mm-hmm. You can't do that if you stand up random roadblocks in the middle of the night in minority communities. You don't do it in wealthy communities. Are you telling me there's no crime there or no criminals live in those communities? So perception is everything. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I did was eliminate random roadblocks. We don't do that kind of work. I ensure that officers that are disciplined for various violations, especially excessive force, I leave and make sure that there is a strong message to my officers about what the ramifications are about mistreating people. I've had to terminate people and fight the union, the FOP, about why this officer is a good guy. And I tell them, I'm not looking for a person that you think is a good guy when they've mistreated a community member. But now we've gotten to a place where people know what to expect, and it's helped to correct behavior.
You mentioned the union, and here in Minnesota, everybody knows and understands that the move that Chief Arredondo did in firing the 4 officers would be responded to by Lieutenant Bob Crow, who leads our police union. And the talk on the street in the community is always whether the union runs the police department or does the chief run it? Does the union run it or does the mayor that the chief reports to? And so there is this real sense, and the union never does anything to dismiss it. So they cultivate this idea of their power, and they like for people to say that, one shoe is dropped, but that's not the final shoe, right? And so how did you deal with your union? And Brittany, what's your sense of that dynamic here in Minneapolis and St. Paul? I can say that this dismissal probably was the fastest ever in a case like this. 2 days or 1 day, I think unheard of, unprecedented. And now with today's charges, equally unprecedented. But what about your union, Chief, and how did you deal with them? And how did you deal with the people that were institutions in the organization in their own right, and therefore maybe became roadblocks for you in converting your management to your vision?
Well, I couldn't go in and immediately just fight the union. What I had to do was bring them in the room and explain to them why changes were being made, and really help them to understand and remember why they took the oath in the first place, and that what our work is really all about. And the fact that even if you're in a union, you're in the FOP or whatever organization that you're in, you cannot forget the fact that you took this job to serve and protect the community, period. And when a community member says that I pay your salary, I tell them they absolutely do. And you owe it to them to treat them in an equitable way. And so we've had these conversations about, trying to help condition them to really understand how important it is for our brand as a department, our legitimacy as law enforcement officers, that we can't just not have rules and guidelines. Because if you're telling me that you want a rogue officer working with you, you've picked the wrong job. You've absolutely picked the wrong job. So we've had to have those kind of conversations. They were tough initially, but we have gotten past that. I will say that I believe that Chief Arredondo's union might be stronger in that they have more negotiating power, labor negotiations and things. And with that, sometimes there's this feeling of immunity to certain types of regulations, and it's harder to shift the culture when you have that kind of environment. I went to the FBI Academy with Chief Arredondo. He's a very, very sharp guy. I know he has the city's best interests at heart. This is a very difficult place for him to be in, but I was very happy to see that he took quick and swift actions, knowing that that was going to cause some internal, problems in the department, probably for months and years to come. But that's what we have to do. This work is not for the faint at heart.
Brittany, jump in, please. Just build on that, and just I'm interested in expanding the conversation. So, policing, point of contact, but beyond that, the issue of wealth, the issue of health, the issue of education, all of these go into how people present themselves, grow themselves, learn, and how opportunity occurs or does not occur.
Right.
And I think you're saying that it's not, you started looking at the contact, but the big picture is really a big picture.
Mm-hmm. So I want to first share a story connected to exactly what Chief Davis said. So my daughter, Brooklyn, is a 6th grader.
Bring
and
your mic up
year,
again. Bring your mic up close. There we go.
Yeah, my daughter Brooke is a 6th grader, and last year, in our former school, she was in her school student council, and they brought Chief Arredondo to her school. And I also work with the school to bring a number of other speakers to expose the children to both different critical kind of urban issues. And a question that my daughter asked the chief was, "What are you doing to make sure that police violence against Black people stops?" And most of her peers were looking at her like, "What?" But we have these conversations frequently in our home. This is like talking about bread or eggs in the morning. But she asked him this very direct question, and his response to her was he was trying to change the culture, and it took time. So it's a moment that I remember as my daughter was in a position to ask Arredondo what's happening. And this is about a year or so ago when this interaction happened. So as Chief Davis talks about what it took for her to come in, change a culture, challenge people to think about their ethics, it does take time. But then these moments happen where your ethics are challenged and you have to make a decision to stand on those ethics. And I'm really glad to see Chief Arredondo do that. And in relation to your larger question, just about kind of the larger issue, when Chief Davis mentioned that we were in a pandemic, I think we just might have forgot that moment. I'm not going to lie to you. Like a couple of weeks ago, I was asking myself, like, what does post-COVID look like?
Right.
Because as a mother of 2, working from home, homeschooling 2, processing the ways in which I'm trying to be present and save space for community members. I also realized that this pandemic is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown people. Disproportionately impact the economic realities of those folks, many who have lost their jobs, find themselves subject to a dire health reality. What you're seeing on the streets is compounded, as we mentioned before, compounded years of trauma, and then compounded within a context that this nation hasn't experienced in, I don't know, maybe since the flu epidemic.
Spanish flu.
Yeah, I'm like, since that point, I think we are witnessing the rawness of where people really are at, and even being able to feel like their humanity is being honored.
There's a story in Monday's issue of Inside News that mentions Duchess Harris, Professor Duchess Harris over in St. Paul, and she has written and talked about the Red Summer. And the Red Summer was the summer of the Spanish flu epidemic just after World War I, in which Black GIs returning from Europe, victorious, were almost lynched and or killed, and Black families, destroyed, even in northern cities. And they tied the willingness of the society to marginalize or to destroy this Black will, this Black confidence that came out of the war effort. They tied it to the Spanish flu. So 3 things happening. One is you racialize a health issue, calling it Spanish flu, Spanish code brown, code not white for sure. 2, they presented things that would suggest a connection between Black people and the flu, the pandemic, and had policies forcing Black soldiers to deal only with Black people, or that they wouldn't deal with Black people that were affected, only Black soldiers would. So putting people at risk in a policy system that was racialized. And then finally, the consequence of that, breaking the sense of progress that Blacks were developing and experiencing, having stepped up and served our country. And you come back and you get your neck crushed again. And so that's kind of the parallel. And here we are looking the same way with COVID-19 and this crisis with George Floyd is an example of things that are going on across the country. So we look at that as an incident, but it's emblematic of things that are happening to Black people all over the country that have been happening, that we've been told weren't happening, that they were isolated, but we know that they weren't isolated. But now we have evidence because of the TV, because of the video. So,
and Al, do you mind if I jump in here?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. I think one of the things that Chief Davis mentioned and that Brittany touched on as well, that was a ray of hope and a glimmer of hope in the COVID pandemic, was that people looking at policing thought, and maybe still do think, and maybe still do hope, that what we saw on how police were changing their tactics and changing how they were approaching people, being more careful, for public health reasons, right? Mm-hmm. That would be something that could be built on after the pandemic and post-pandemic. And I think Brittany's absolutely right that George Floyd, this situation, it either shattered that notion or it really showed us how it's just hard work, right? It's just hard work to do that, and that it's not easy to build on those things. But from a principle level, the idea of maintaining distance between law enforcement and people that they come into contact with is crucial and is core, and it's something that, in addition to de-escalation, is kind of a precursor to it, if you will, because the more room that you have in between, the less there is a chance of something escalating to begin with, and that when that room narrows, and law enforcement talks about it all the time. It's like a 10-foot rule, right? The person on the street could come and attack and cover 10 feet within a matter of seconds. And so that's something that is kind of ingrained in the training and the culture. But now it's the same thing the other way for a law enforcement officer who may have coronavirus, to maintain that distance. And so keeping that distance was something that people were looking at as maybe a best practice going post-COVID. But on top of that, though, I think, I want to echo what folks have been saying, not only about Chief Arredondo. I've had the pleasure of getting to know him as well. And it does take work, and it just shows you how fragile even incremental change is to that. And it's kind of naive for us to think that within a matter of even just 3 years, 5 years of strong, intensive work, that's going to overcome decades of policing communities, Black communities, in the way that policing in America has shown. And so it's such a fragile thing, and I hesitate to be kind of discouraging in this way, but I think we have to be realistic about it as well.
Ed, what would you say is the philosophy of policing Black communities? So what's the history of policing Black communities in this country?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that the history of this country and policing shows it is built on racial hierarchy, and it is a racial system. It's systemic racism. I don't think that there's any doubt. I think that, when you have 5 years ago chiefs talking about, like openly talking about and apologizing for the racism and how it's built out of slavery, I don't think that there's any doubt about that. For people who are going to try to come into an intellectual discussion about that, that's not the case. I don't know if there's any way to really have an initial conversation there. But that's the thing that I think Chief Davis mentioned, that other chiefs has talked about. The thing is that that's morphed into different types of policing tactics over the years. So most recently, in a big city like New York, you're talking about stop and frisk in Black communities, in Black and Brown communities, right? You're talking about checkpoints, like Chief Davis was talking about. And you talk about also the issue of over-policing. Now, I'm fortunate to live in a community here in the DC area that's relatively safe, but why is my community safe? Is it because I have policing all over the place? No, it's because my neighbors have opportunities. It's because there are opportunities and there's investment by the government in my community other than policing? And so those are the things that I think, the broader cross-intersectional things that Brittany was touching on before, that really need to be covered when we're talking about policing as well.
The community in Washington, D.C., you could say, I think, Black people own because they're present in the criminal justice enterprise. Is that a fair statement or not? Or is it Black people as a community still on the outside or at the periphery of the power in criminal justice in DC? What do you think, Ed?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question because DC has become increasingly gentrified over the last several years, and so the gentrification issues are really at play here. You're talking about several wards that when the rest of the city there's business investment, development, and things like that. There's Ward 7 and 8 and different places in Northeast and Southeast that have had just disinvestment, and so I think that, yes, there is a strong Black community that has power and voice that may be different than others. But at the same time, you're also seeing who are the ones that are being policed still. It's not people who look like me. It's not people who necessarily are in different neighborhoods. So I think, yes, there is agency there, definitely. But there is also a lot of work when it comes to different wards and different neighborhoods in the city as well.
So, Brittany, how do you link the need to examine and change police culture, the criminal justice process, so that it becomes equitable, not equitable as an idea, but equitable in action, more equitable? Let me look at your note here. Equity, moving it from equity-based language to equity-based actions. What is the action to get us there? And I'm thinking that means, as we said, it's not just policing. It's about food. It's about health access. It's about knowledge, learning, education. It's about work, income, having a job, and like Ed said, being a community that is able to do for itself. And I wrote an essay years ago called Black Crime, Black Punishment, suggesting that some difference would be if Black people owned every element of the criminal justice system that impacts their life. Might have been short-sighted, I don't know, but Brittany, respond, please.
Yeah, I think this is huge. I use this phrase often because in Minnesota, I think equity is like the word "the." It's a word that we all use to either signify our progressiveness or signify to others our commitment to do better, but then not actually know how to act in that manner. I think you're right to say that this is all intersectional. Usually when I'm pulling tables together for major, whether it's engagement projects or collect data, I'm pulling tables together of folks across sector who never talk to each other. It is fascinating. Every time I pull these tables together. So for instance, we did a 2-year study on evictions, where we're pulling the courts together, where we're pulling the schools together, like for them to actually be in a room and talk about the way that their processes either look past one another or across each other is like a novel pursuit. And I find that half of my work is people work. So I'm paid to collect data, analyze data, support the creation of action research projects. But I find that half of my job has nothing to do with actually collecting data or analyzing it. It's helping people talk to each other, develop shared meaning around a policy, practice, or even an idea, and to then provide each other like some humanity in exchange. Because we come in with our like professional hat or our personal baggage on our back of what we expect someone else to say or how we expect them to engage with us. And there's a lot of defensiveness in the beginning of those exchanges. So I spend a lot of time getting folks to think about, what are your core values? Let's take our professional hat off and figure out what you value. I would argue for this work to be successful, multiple entities need to be able to come to those tables and see each other's humanity beyond the positions they hold, assess what our core values are, because you'll be so surprised how much they align. You'd be so surprised. So a lot of my initial work starts there. And then that surgical kind of examination has to take place without you being in your feelings, white people. I mean, that is really what it comes down to. Because the reality of it is we are all implicated in what's wrong. But you can't use the word equity as a sign of your white progressiveness and not be okay being called out on your bullshit. That doesn't work together. That won't work ever. And that's usually the space in which I move. We need to have these conversations across silos. I have made many attempts to work with the Minneapolis Police Department, as I noted before, on the engagement around studying police culture and practice and thinking about ethics specifically. And the offer still on the table. And it seems like needed even more. Mm-hmm. So I'm ready to roll my sleeves up and do the actual surgical work. Are you willing to engage in that debate with me?
Listen, we're out of time. This has been a good session. I'll take another minute, though, to have a parting comment from you, Ed Chung, and from you, Chief Davis. But first of all, thank all of you. Thank you so much for the energy, the ideas, the thought, and this opportunity to share and connect. I call this a robust conversation. Ed Chung, impression of thought?
Just real quick, I mean, I think it takes people like Chief Davis first to lead a department, to change a department. But so much more, as Chief Davis knows. It takes time. It's not only about police unions. It's not about the sergeant levels, captain levels. It's about people like the city manager, people who are controlling the city budgets. It's people who place expectations on police, and that's the entire society, entire community. What do we expect of our police, and what should they be doing? And I think that's an examination that each community should take on their own and should determine, not to have that be determined by police, but to have that determined by the community. And the community does not only include, white communities or Asian communities or Black communities. It's a whole community, but we have to especially look at the communities that have been most affected by policing and over-policing and police misconduct. So thanks so much for having me.
One more thing, though, Ed. I wanted you to address the question of interest.
Yeah.
Where do interest come into play? And that was the thought behind the narrative that I presented earlier. In whose interest? Mm-hmm. And how do people protect their interest? And how do we get to where we see value, look at interest differently in ways that allow us all to be co-creators, and not one the creator, the owner, and the other the supplicant. That's the point, the question. What do you think, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm going to answer your question directly. If I understand it correctly, I think the difficulty when it comes to some of these police reform issues is that everybody is looking inward and at self-interest. And so when we talk about, as Chief Davis talked, implicit bias training is kind of a minimal baseline first step that can happen and that should happen, I think, in a lot of situations, but it's nowhere near the end. But if that's going to cause you to look just only at yourself as an officer and say that I'm being blamed for something and I'm not, and things like that, then how can you look at the interest not only of the city writ large, but of your own police department writ large? And so I don't think I'm answering your question directly, but I think that there are all of these different interests at play, and too often we have those interests that are not meshing together and that are in a self-preservation mode. And as soon as we get out of that and start out of that, I think that's when some progress truly.
Great, thank you, Chief Davis. Final words for you.
Yeah, this has been a great discussion, and I do believe that you all are absolutely right as far as where the work needs to take place, but police agencies can't do it in a silo, because we can't continue to train our officers on what we think the community needs. I think that we need to have more opportunities for community members to come in to tell officers why they feel some kind of way. In an environment that's not an intimidating environment, a very real discussion, a deeper dive about history, I think history is so important. It's that first layer. And we started a history class in my police academies about the history of the city of Durham and what the ills are in that city, and why people in certain communities feel a certain kind of way about the police because of that history. And it helps them to have at least a frame of reference of how they can approach a particular community, because they know the history behind, you know, what has occurred there, and they can work on the building process. But as I said before, I'm one city. These concepts that I have, a lot of it is who I am. So I try to share what has worked for me with my colleagues. And believe it or not, a lot of my white colleagues are very open to listening, because they don't know where to go. They don't know how to get to the roots of some of these problems. Mm-hmm. So I say that, you know, there is hope in spite of, you know, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, even in Brunswick, Georgia. There is hope, and we can't give up. We have to continue to have these conversations and really put some action behind it with policy changes. Thanks,
you. Thanks, one and all. Thanks, Brittany Lewis, Dr. Brittany Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edward Chung, Ed Chung, and thank you, Chief C.J. Davis. I'm Al McFarlane. If you enjoy this conversation, like it, share it, or follow us or subscribe to us on YouTube, and be here with us every day. We're doing this 5 days a week, sometimes several times a day, creating robust conversations. We enjoy it. We hope it's of value to you. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye, guys.